This is Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Inspiring and providing real insight to our listeners with every story. Exploring deep stories behind every guest. Please welcome your host, Bo Tiffany.
Welcome back to another episode of Digital Voices. Today we have Phyllis Leavitt and Robert Mills back to talk about the family of America, and more specifically, America's cry for help. So with that said, welcome back, Robert and Phyllis. And Phyllis, why don't you take us off? Tell us what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, I'm going to start off by just explaining what that term means, America's cry for help. And it comes right out of something I learned early on in the world of family therapy. From the very beginning of my practice, I started treating children, and I thought I was going to do a lot of play therapy with individual children. But as it turned out, almost, I would say 95 or more percent of the children that were referred for therapy were coming because of a problematic and sometimes very hostile divorce happening between their parents. And so they came for a variety of reasons: bedwetting, nightmares, fears of going to school, aggression toward their siblings, you name it. There were all kinds of symptoms that these children had. And I very soon learned that you really had to look at what was going on in the family if you were going to treat the children with any hope of success. So I had a little girl that was referred to me for bedwetting, and I called her parents in, and to begin with, just to get a family history and find out what they thought was going on with her. She was 12, I think. And they were like, we don't know. Everything seems okay. We don't really know why she's doing this. And so the first session I did was I had the whole family come in with her and her two siblings. And I did something called a family sculpture, in which each person takes a turn and they set up a scene, any scene they want from the family, and they give each person one line to say. And the mother went, the father went, the two sisters went, and just all these very benign, we're having lunch, doing homework, whatever scenes. And I'm thinking to myself, what's missing here? And then the little girl went last, who was wetting the bed. She put her mother on one side of the room and her father on the other side of the room. She had them stretch their arms out, point at each other, and scream at each other to stop their drug use. So that's what was going on in the family that was affecting this little girl. They're fighting the tension in the family, the hostility, the rage, and the uncertainty of what was going to happen to the family and the couple, in addition to what was happening when the parents were using, was causing her so much anxiety. Her symptom was wetting the bed. Had I not known that, had that not come out, it would have taken probably a long time to discover. I don't know if she ever would have told me. And so that's the model for looking at what's going on in our country and in our large institutions and in our communities, that most often those with the largest, the biggest, most glaring symptoms are calling for help for something going on in the larger family system that's not working and is often abusive, neglectful, alienating, assaultive. And if we look at the family of America, we have mass shootings, we have high incidence of rape, sex trafficking of little children. I mean, we can name, a whole list of horrible ills, murders, drive-by shootings, drug-related crime. And if we only look at those people as bad and they need to be locked up and the key thrown away, we're missing the point. They're calling for help for what's not working in the larger societal structure. And I don't think this is common knowledge, and I want to make it common knowledge, because otherwise we cannot stop this cycle. So please chime in.
Yeah, go ahead, Robert. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think that those are incredible points that I think people need to learn more about and need to hear some of Phyllis's expertise. And I'm going to come to the table here with a broader focus here, which is not which basically complements what Phyllis is saying, okay? Because these stresses and all this dysfunction and anger and hate, and that is coming from the broader society, and it's coming down into the family, and it's creating some of these conditions.
Right.
And I want to talk about what that is and where it's coming from. And I'm going to bring to that discussion a discussion of what's called the DSM-5, which as Phyllis knows is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition. Now, this is the Bible that psychology, psychiatrists, and clinicians that deal with mental disorders of all types in all forms of practice. This is their sort of their Bible. It has a common terminology, describes the common symptoms of mental disorders so that clinicians can use the same vocabulary with each other as they identify and diagnose these symptoms. And what I'm going to argue here is that a portion of one of our political parties, I think it will remain unsaid at this moment because I think you know what I'm talking about, has begun to exhibit behaviors which are classical mental disorders. They are identified and described in lurid detail in the DSM as mental disorders, okay? And they have certain characteristics, and among them is schizophrenia, and that's a mental disorder where people interpret reality abnormally, and there are many symptoms of schizophrenia, including delusions, and a delusion is a belief, usually strongly held, in the absence of proof, and in fact, in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And a subcategory of schizophrenia, which I'll be talking about, is called delusional disorder, and it's manifested by paranoid beliefs, belief that you're being followed, spied on, poisoned, indicted, and all kinds of conspiratorial thinking, and a disordered thinking. And I'm going to come back as Lois goes over this and talk about how the national conversation taking place now, with the former president and large portions of his public, not all of them, okay? And I want to be clear about that there are many conservative voices out there, some of them quite conservative, that I have read for years, a columnist in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and others who are quite wise, and they have much to say that's worth listening to, and it's legitimate. And and a lot of Republicans will agree with what I'm going to say. Okay, it sounds like an extremely partisan point of view, but it is one that's shared by a great number of people. But anyway, that point of view will be to try to point out the ways in which the larger political landscape and the larger social landscape has now taken on these characteristics, and it's very scary, of mental disorders, and we'll talk about that. I mean, Phyllis, to talk about, to elaborate on that, and where in the broader society this is coming from.
Well, what I want to say is, those are very helpful diagnostic terms because they identify certain behaviors and certain behavioral patterns, and they're helpful in our broader understanding to know where some of the extremes of mental illness are taking us. So in that light, let's incorporate some of the DSM into what we're talking about. But remember that most people, unless they're born with some kind of brain abnormality, some inherited trait that sets them up to misinterpret reality on a broad scale and not be able to see clearly anything that's in front of them because of some brain, anomaly. Most people are not born with delusions. They acquire them through their experience, either through terrible trauma that has distorted their way of thinking and coping, and or the conditioning around them has brainwashed them into thinking and believing things that are not true, that serve someone's purpose. And that's what part of what my book, America in Therapy, is about, that abusive people people who want to hold power and control over others with no investment in the welfare of the people that they have power and control over, and in fact often exploit and misuse the people that they have power and control over, perpetrate a mass sort of a theology, or what, it's not the right word, a way of thinking, a way of believing what is true about other people that is not true, but it's all that the people under their control are exposed to often. And so they incorporate those beliefs and they act on those beliefs as if they're true. And it's also, so what I'm saying is you don't become delusional overnight. Something happens. And that's part of the family structure that I'm talking about, the ill mental health in the family of America that's breeding this kind of delusional thinking, delusional behavior, and then acting as if it's true, with terribly destructive behaviors that are aggressive toward other people, that are discriminating toward other people, and all the things that you have some specific details about, Robert.
Well, let's take that point, and okay, I want to follow up on what Lois just said here, and the point of view I want to stress here is that this craziness that we're talking about does not just strike crazy people. Okay, I want to use an example here of Laura Logan. Okay, Laura Logan worked her way up in media to being the chief foreign correspondent for CBS, and then she wanted to be the highly respected correspondent for 60 Minutes on TV. And then something happened to her. I mean, she began to go down the rabbit hole of QAnon, and she was ended up being fired by CBS. And she went on, she was hired by Newsmax, and then ultimately she was fired by Newsmax because she went on and she started talking about how there was this global elite that wanted you to eat insects, and she went into the QAnon stuff about how they dine on the blood of children, and how the Democrats and Hillary Clinton are operating a child sex trafficking ring out of a pizza parlor in Washington, and a host of other sort of incredible sounding delusions that eventually got her fired even from Newsmax. And so I bring her up because, if somebody like that can become a victim and can fall prey to this, then others can as well. This is a sophisticated, very successful person, and there are many others. And so what I see is that this extremely toxic form of behavior, very contagious form of behavior, by the way. Last week, there was some instances where Mexicans, middle schoolers all fainted because they heard about each other and stuff. And so there's a long history of various kinds of delusions being toxic and contagious. And people who don't even have social contact, which can learn about it and imitate that behavior. So you combine all of that with this a media environment which really pitches the notion that there are people out to get you. They're trying to take away your life. They're trying to take away your guns, your Bibles, your religion, your culture, your values. They're out to get you. And that scares people. It creates that fear that Lois has been talking about, that they have to protect themselves somehow. And it's creating an enormous amount of anger in our society, which we see in those mass shootings and other things, and creating this dysfunctional outlook. So I'm going to be paralleling what she's talking about happening on the family level with what is scarily happening on the national level through our dialogue and through a portion of one of the political parties.
I love what you guys are saying. I think that what we could do a little bit is, Phyllis, there's a certain amount of biological, we're not born dysfunctional. You said that a little while ago. But depending on your family dynamics, you might be born into a dysfunctional family, which then leads to dysfunction, right? And it could be mental health. It could be, it takes its form in a variety of ways within mental health.
Right.
But what we're talking about, I think, is the weaponization of these family dynamics, or these family problems. I don't know if that's a great way to hone that word, or to hone that, but basically you're taking this family dynamic that, you know, we've been treating with psychology and in this mental health field for, you know, 150 years roughly. And we've gotten so good that we've started to weaponize it to control the masses. And unless I'm wrong, isn't that kind of what we're talking about here, Robert and Phyllis, is we're talking about these normal everyday things that families deal with that lead to various, you know, dysfunctions depending on the family that you're born into or the situation. We're talking about how to get over that, but we're also talking with Robert, you know, his bigger focus is how that's been weaponized and how that's become a tool to create the populace or popular opinion rather, and to really steer the ship of our nation in a way that's never been done quite like this before. And I think one of the big technologies that really pushed this and what's made this as big as it is the internet and the globalization that's come from that. You know, we now have all these outlets of fake news, and we have these political things like Cambridge Analytics, where they're weaponizing, you know, social media to steer popular opinion. So I wanted to kind of just hone that out, because that is kind of what we're talking about, isn't it? We're talking about these normal things that we've been dealing with as a family for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years, and now we've entered this era where it's become weaponized in a way that I don't think we've ever seen throughout history before.
Well, let me speak to that specific point. This week, a couple of days ago, David French is one of my favorite columnists. He's a writer, and he wrote a column in the New York Times in which he talked about how it was partly autobiographical, where he was engaged to a young woman, 24 years old, they were both 24, and her father said, "If you want to marry my daughter, you've got to go to this week-long seminar given by this extreme right-wing group that is influencing evangelical America." He mentioned the guy, I think his name was Gotham. You have to go to this seminar to marry my daughter and see what we're all about here. So he went to it, and he was horrified by what he saw, by the controlling evilness and darkness of what he saw. But what also shocked him was how these seemingly normal people, healthy, well-adjusted people, could, in the right circumstances of listening to this guy and his haranguing them, could be brought under his control and his spell, and could be convinced of doing extreme things and thinking extreme things, and pulled from their ordinary life into a form of madness. And after taking a good look at this, he broke his engagement with this young woman, but he sees these symptoms. He sees this taking place in the media environment today, which we've all been talking about, and in which people are being pitched this extreme notion. And we are a great deal more susceptible, I think, as a nation to this and as people than most people realize. We are vulnerable, as all these cults have taken place over the years show. And I could recite a whole bunch of them that were in a column about, you know, cult leaders leading people into death again and again in the last 20 years. And we are, as a people, as a human beings, like Lois said, we're not irrational, we're not born crazy, but we are susceptible to be driven crazy or led into crazy ways by bad leaders.
Yeah, and I don't think there's one explanation for why that happens. So I think we have to be open to that there's many avenues by which people come to be influenced in that way. And certainly some of those people, whether they appear to be this way or not, are victims of abuse who are easily controlled. They may look put together on the outside, but they may not be put together on the inside. And they may be very vulnerable, feel very overpowered or overpowering, and identify with a kind of cult that gives them a sense of belonging, a sense of power that they don't feel in their own lives. And certainly there's something to be said that's undeniable about the power of a group as opposed to the power of an individual. It's very intoxicating. And it has a sort of a life and a power of its own. So that's one thing that I would say about it. And I totally agree with the idea of weaponizing psychology. I think that there are people who just act out in their own families, in their businesses, and in their positions of power because they really have been conditioned to act out. And it's not premeditated. They're just doing what they learned or the best way that they've learned how to cope. But there is, I think, a growing sense of, or a growing realization that there are people who are consciously and deliberately manipulating others with psychological weapons, knowing what does generate fear. How do you get people to project their own shadow impulses, their own worries, their insecurity, their anger onto another group of people? But all of this is about maintaining power and control, whether it's greed, sexual power, political power, whatever the power is, it's harnessed to keep those in power and grow their power. And I think we saw that with Hitler. A country was turned against one race of people to the point where they were built ovens. That to me is inconceivable, and yet it happened. And so, yes, there is something about this mass influence. I might have mentioned her before, there's a forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Bandy Lee who has been extremely outspoken about terming ex-President Trump as mentally ill on a very severe end of the continuum. And she's written books about it and collaborated with other mental health professionals to really look deeply into what that mental illness looks like and how it's manifesting. And she calls it the Trump contagion. And I think that's what you're talking about. It's like, as this swell of mental illness grows and is not stopped, then it accelerates at sort of whatever the word is, an exponential speed. And I think that's some of what we're seeing, that it's contagious. It's in the environment, almost like, a germ might be in the environment, or a virus or a bacteria, and people kind of catch it. But I think we still have to remember to go back to, for me, where I started with the family dynamic, that even those people who, stormed the Capitol on January 6th, they are also symptom bearers for the ills of our country. And we have to know that. Otherwise, we're just going to say these are, there's mass craziness and these people need to be locked up. And maybe some of them do need to be restrained to be safe for the rest of us. But that's not the answer if we really want to reverse this course.
On the political front, I mean, we have seen, in the last 100 years or so, a number of rises of dictators who became totalitarians, who completely controlled people, and they used these very techniques we're talking about to get people, as you were pointing out, Lois, to believe that all the world's problems and all of their problems personally were being created by this tiny group of Jews who were running everything secretly behind the scenes, behind all that was evil. And they convinced normal, intelligent, educated people of absurd things and got them to do unimaginable evil in the influence of that. And the Soviets did the same thing, and Mussolini did that. And, we're seeing that today with, this extremely skilled propaganda by the far right, which a lot of it's just absurd that people are believing it, and they're convincing people that one of the national political parties, the Democrats, are running pedophiles out of a pizza parlor, and that they are doing all of these things that are preposterous. And one of the underlying tactics of this is to destroy the notion of truth. Okay, one of the anchors of sanity is the idea that there is such a thing as truth. and there's such a thing as not truth. There's a lie. And one of the things that dictators and political organizations, and this includes the religious fanatics controlling these groups that and cults, they all want to eliminate the idea that there's any such thing as truth and any alternative explanations for anything. And so you see that happening now in America. And one of the things that, I saw two examples of that today that I thought were quite remarkable. One of them was that, Hunter Biden, President Biden's son, solved his political problems, his criminal accusing problems, and it was in a big package deal in Delaware. And why is that important? Because the person who was in charge of prosecuting him was David Weiss, who was appointed by none other than Donald Trump. He was appointed by Donald Trump specifically to prosecute Hunter Biden. And Biden had nothing to do with it. And his attorney general, Merrick Garland, had nothing to do with it, never communicated with him. And this prosecutor was allowed to stay on when Biden took power, unlike what happens with all the other U.S. attorneys that are changed with administrations. This guy was allowed by Biden to stay in power, and he was told by Merrick Garland specifically in writing he had unlimited authority to pursue this investigation wherever, and even including in other jurisdictions, wherever it led him, they would support him. And he came to this conclusion, and all day long today in Congress and in the media, the Republicans have been saying there's two tiers of justice, and Biden's corrupt, Department of Justice is giving this guy a slap on the wrist. He's getting this special sweetheart deal, and on, all of which is just manifestly lie. But it's designed to rile people up and get the base unhappy. But they're willing. And this really is disturbing that people who know better, these leaders, are telling people something that is absolutely manifestly false, and they know that it's false. So I found that disturbing, and I found that an example. And the other thing that I wanted to mention about the sweetheart deal, what is it? They went on and on talking about Hunter Biden again and his deals in Ukraine. He was hired by this energy company in Ukraine and paid millions of dollars to be on their board. And he had no expertise for this. He was miles over his head. And it was clear to anybody that he was hired in an effort to curry favor and influence peddle and so forth in the White House. Nobody paid much attention to him. It didn't really work. But what was interesting is they went back and they went on and on and on about this, and yet there was not a single word about Ivanka Trump with her $1 billion deal in China, getting 34 patents on things, or Jared Kushner's deal with Oman, or his enormous deal with Saudi Arabia, which he reached while he was sitting in the White House, which is, so there was nothing illegal about what Hunter Biden did, and there's really no dispute about it. I think that there's a wide agreement on both parties or everywhere that we should have laws about the relatives of presidents, getting these kind of things and how they should be handled. But both parties acknowledge nothing illegal about it. But here they are pounding away on it in a way that is manifestly misleading and inaccurate. When Trump's own kids have 1,000 times more at stake in it. And so, but what you see here is this overarching need to vilify one party, one side, by the other side, and to show them as illegitimate, and to create anger, and to create a sense of woundedness and a sense of unfairness about it. And so one more point on this truth thing, and that is that one of the foundations of truth is if somebody lies to you once, that they should lose credibility, show you some accountability for that in terms of their diminished credibility the next time. And here we are with Trump today, arguing like the 6 different explanation for his taking the papers. I mean, the first one was he could declassify them in his mind. He told that in an interview. The FBI planted these documents. The National Archives planted these documents. And, you know, he didn't take them, but he did take them, but he needed them to work to work at the office. And, you know, each one of these is mutually exclusive of the others. And only one can be true. The others have to be false. So here's this guy with 6 different lies, all mutually exclusive. And no one is calling him out and saying, wait a minute, you know, you're being accused of this stuff. And, you know, how can you say this when you just said that, you know? But finally, one last point here, you know, and I agree. This is the indictment here. You know, I think everybody should read. It's only 40 pages. But what's interesting about it is you go out in the street and ask Republicans, you know, about this indictment. They say, oh, it's this two-sided justice, you know, nothing happens when Biden walked out with papers and Pence walked, and nothing happened to them. Nothing happened to Hillary, but with these papers. And look what's happening to Trump. But the interesting thing is in this indictment, it doesn't start the accusations until 18 months downstream. And it wasn't his taking the documents wrongly and illegally that they accuse him of. It was after 18 months of jacking around, he starts lying and hiding them and obstructing. And once they were subpoenaed, you know, he refused to give them back then and starts hiding them and moving them and lying about it and getting other people to lie about it. And that's this whole basis of the indictment. But nobody seems to know that because they're not being told. They're being told something else. Again, an example of which there are many thousands of them, of how, you know, people are being manipulated to feel victimized and to feel that the government, the FBI, all these agencies are being undermined, that everybody's out to get this leader and you have to believe him and not believe anybody else. And all this is a very toxic stew for families and for individuals to be subjected to. And it translates out into ways that Lois is writing about and has insights about, that goes right down into the families and individuals. And she can now speak to that. And I personally don't think that religion today, except for these extreme fundamentalist groups, these evangelicals are very much enthralled of the extremists. They are part and parcel of it, okay? And you see these behaviors there. And there's occasional congregations here and there. But on the whole, you know, especially in America, religion has cooled like a fire, you know, to the embers are barely warm today. I mean, you go back 50 years. I mean, I give these history tours, and you know, back in the turn of the century, 19th century, in San Francisco, there were disputes about whether a particular priest should be in the Golden Gate Park, and families were divided on it. That this was a hot thing. People cared about the dogmas of religion and whether this was true and that was true, and who was a sinner, who, you know, and if you go back further, I mean, the religious fervor is what populated the United States. There was a murderous rampage that took place in Europe, and 50% of the population of what's now Germany slaughtered the other 50% with swords, women and children, over trivias of theology. I mean, the Protestants would go to one Catholic village and the Catholic village would go to another Protestant, and they slaughtered, and to escape that madness and that mass slaughter, millions of people left Europe and came to the United States and populated it. And one of the first things they did when they got here was to start persecuting people who disagreed with them. And this led, when the founding fathers got together, to, in their wisdom, they realized that they didn't have a quote prayer setting up this republic unless they fixed that. And so that's where the First Amendment comes from, and the idea of religious tolerance. And the United States is the first place on earth with this notion of religious tolerance. You know, when I did a podcast with you talking about how the Spanish Armada, defeat of that, led to the creation of tolerance, which is the defining intellectual point, foundation of Western civilization. As we know, what we call the West today, it started out as religious tolerance, became political tolerance, and that's where it all came from. Okay, and you know, but today in America, it's cooled down to the point where, I mean, most churches are, I mean, when I was a kid, I got up in front of them and I talked about, hey, how can you believe in virgin birth? And I was one of those firebrand young kids. And what quickly came to me, and this was some time ago, was that people came to this Methodist church in some little town in the Midwest out of fellowship. I mean, they didn't care about all this doctrine stuff and they didn't care about all, they just wanted to be there with their friends that they hadn't seen, and they wanted to be there and sing these hymns that were like lullabies to them they've been doing since kids, and they got some emotional, and it was all for goodness, and it brought out the best in them and the best in their friends. They talked about things that would, and it was not about their neighbor being wrong or theological. That was hundreds of years before that. And it today in America, with exception of these evangelical crazies, of which there are significant numbers of them, but they're a minority, a significant minority, and the rest of it is religiously sort of benign, actually, in terms of their political influence, because they espouse forgiveness and love and things like that, at least on the surface, and a lot of them appear to believe that and try to act that way. So I think that it's the political operatives who are doing this for commercial reasons, as I point out in my last memo with you guys. That, I see America as being run by these interest groups who have enormous financial stakes in the current system, which I think I ran a company with thousands of financial hundreds of financial planners who ran, and I saw firsthand just how much is given to the wealthy in this country on a regular basis. I mean, and I am no left wing, I mean, I saw that trillions of dollars of giveaways and tax benefits and other special deals are given to the wealthy in this country, and they want to preserve that. And that's why they got the Supreme Court to rule on the Citizens United case, which bars Congress or anybody from in any way putting a stop to this or even regulating it. I mean, you can give money secretly to anybody, and foreign countries coming now and donate to political parties. And the corruption that this generates is staggering. And, I give these history tours in San Francisco, and I talk about this red light district that we call the Barbary Coast in San Francisco. Especially, it was fueling, there weren't that many women in San Francisco, and it was a huge red light district. And they couldn't get rid of it. And they tried for generations. And it was full of corruptions and sex trafficking and drugs and crime and disease and everything. They couldn't get rid of it, even though the overwhelming majority. Why? Because of cash bribes paid to the politicians and paid to the police that just overrode the will of the people. It took until 1919 on Valentine's Day, when finally, with the bullhorn of the media, the what's his name, the great William Randolph Hearst turned his megaphone against it, and that created this right, the mayor and the chief of police and ran on this, and they won, and they gathered up 300 paddy wagons and an army of police that went into this community and smashed it to pieces, and it never came back. But it took that. And so I see that this is going to frustrate. I see it underlining any effort of what Phyllis and I will talk about as the solutions to the problems that we see are being engineered and by these mega forces that I frankly don't see any ready way of controlling them, because they've rigged it up so they can't be controlled. And they are incredibly good at this. I mean, they're much better at this than the good guys. Their messaging is incredibly good, and they vilified all of and they talk about the Democrats, they talk about their opposition in ways we never ever did in America before. That the Democrats are illegitimate. But they're trying to destroy America. There's no restraint and no shame in it. And the result of that is really doing huge damage to democracy itself. But it is astonishingly effective. And they're getting people to believe these horrible things. And that's been seeping down to the level that Lois deals with in her therapy, of seeing people angry and mad at each other and having dysfunctional examples of how you resolve conflict. And they're seeing this bitter, like the parents fighting. This is the parents fighting that we're all being witness to, which every therapist like Phyllis sees. And, when the couple has this ugly divorce, it has tremendous damaging influence on the children. And we, the voters, are the children. And we're seeing this and witnessing it on a nationwide scale. Phyllis.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you brought it back to the family therapy model as it applies to the country, because that's exactly what I see. These are highly destructive and violent abuse dynamics playing out, and taking it back to your theme, Bo. I do want to say something about that, about places of worship, religious organizations that not so much from the point of view of historically, but what my observation is that people are people no matter where they go. And whether they're in a business or in government or in their home or in their church, we play out the dynamics that we've learned. We play out our issues everywhere. People who have become passive in their homes tend to be passive in their workplace and in their church. And those who identify with the aggressor and want to dominate others tend to do that in their workplace and in their friendships and in their families and in their churches. And so you see these really dysfunctional group dynamics playing out everywhere. And the one thing that I would just say about, because there is such a historical perspective on, on the church and its power and its role in the, sort of the evolution or de-evolution or whatever of civilization, that when you have your argument based on what you believe and you're telling other people is the word of God, there's nothing beyond that, I think, for humans to go. And so there is tremendous power in that even though, from my point of view, from a psychological point of view, we see God the way we have been taught to see humans. If we see the divine in humans, then we might see a loving, benevolent God, and a just God. If we have been taught that some people are superior and others are inferior and they're not worthy of being treated well, then we're going to formulate a God who espouses the same beliefs. And I think that's what you see happening in a lot of religious institutions. But I also really want to bring it down to the personal level, because we're not immune, even if we're not out slaughtering people with swords. And I'll tell you this from my own experience. I was in a spiritual group in my 20s, and it was, it was fine. It wasn't espousing any kind of hatred of anyone else. It was really, trying to develop yourself in your connection to your own divine nature. It had very loving, not benign, but loving, connecting to your inner self principles. Those were the principles of this spiritual practice and the spiritual group. But people still played out their stuff. There was a lot of infidelity. There was a lot of, struggling for power within the hierarchy of the organization. And this is part of what I think is natural in human behavior, that some people are more naturally inclined to dominate, even if they're not coming from an abusive background. And some people are more inclined to follow, even if they're not coming from having been overpowered. And we play these things out. But if they're not played out in some way that keeps an eye on the common good of everyone, then you just have fertile ground for the misuse of power and the overuse of power, in the name of whatever those in power want to accomplish.
They've been dealing with these issues similar to the modern ones that we're dealing with for quite a long time historically, and they've tried to tackle it by doing a few different things. And I think that there's lessons to be learned just through history sometimes, and so one of those things that has gone a long way with the church is apologies and reconciliation. We're trying to get these people, whether you're Democrats, Republicans, Independents, far left, far right, we want everybody to work together. And so, there's sometimes deep-seated hurts and feelings because of this, that, or historical issues. So we need to wound some of those, we need to heal some of those wounds so that we can move forward. And I think, there's a few lessons like that, that we can borrow from the church towards our own healing. And that was what I was trying to allude to. Looking through that lens, is there anything that we can borrow from, we'll narrow it down to just say the Catholic Church. Is there anything, like I mentioned, the apologies and the reconciliations, or at least the move towards those, also human right advocacy, there's social justice advocacy, theology of peace. There's a lot of things that they've done to try to grow, and they've been around 2,000 years, which is quite a long time. So, again, is there anything that we can learn that we might use towards our own healing?
One of the things that many people know about is the Truth and Reconciliation that happened in Africa, South Africa. And I think, I did a little bit of research on that when I was writing my book, and it's a really powerful model because it incorporates a real drive towards psychological and emotional and mental healing. And so the structure of that was to bring victims of apartheid and those who had perpetrated the worst atrocities of apartheid together for truth and reconciliation. And the condition was that no one would be prosecuted for telling the truth of what they had done to harm other people. And while that might be offensive to some people, it was the only way to make it safe for those who had been caught up in hurting Black people, to have a safe place to own what they had done. And for the victims of those atrocities to actually hear them take responsibility for it. And it was an amazing model. And I won't go into the details of it because we don't need to, but I think that is in the direction of what I'm talking about healing the family of America. We have to, because inside all of the perpetrators of those atrocities are people who were either victims of abuse or were brainwashed into believing that Black people were terrible and deserved the horrible treatment that they got, or that they should be destroyed. And if we don't look through a lens of the possible rehabilitation of all of humanity, we really don't have a chance. Do we know how to rehabilitate everyone? No, but we can work toward that. We can set the stage for that. And I think the whole model of truth and reconciliation, whether it's from a church or from government or from a larger, corporation that's mistreated or, underpaid their clientele, that is an incredible model to start with, because it makes it safe to be accountable for what we've done that isn't okay. So I want to throw that into the mix. That would be an amazing thing for us to model in the United States, and maybe adapt and evolve to an even better model.
With that same thought, is there anything that other nations are doing that we can borrow from? I do know, like Greenland and some of the Scandinavian countries, there's been a lot of press regarding how they've, renovated their own political systems and have brought it more towards the people and grounded more towards the people. Is there anything that we can borrow from that as we try to figure out our road to healing?
Can I throw something in about that, or do you want to go? You can go, Robert.
Well, I hate to be the naysayer here, but I think the last thing on earth that the political powers of the United States want is truth and reconciliation. Truth and reconciliation would undermine their entire objective and their financial interests and everything that they're trying to achieve. And they are making an enormous amount of money and gaining enormous amount of benefits by riling people up and making them feel wounded and angry, and creating as dysfunctional and chaotic a system as they can possibly get away with. And so truth and reconciliation requires, it happened in those countries after the event, okay? Once there was already a democracy, it was a multiracial democracy, and then you could turn to healing. And it made sense then, and everybody had an interest in it then. But in America today, as you just saw today, with Republicans attacking Biden for things that they know perfectly well and distorting the hell out of him and making it seem like he's engaging in some sort of evil, horrible thing to give his son special privileges and everything. When you watch it, you see that that model is unworkable in the United States. And so, how do we solve the problem in the United States? I mean, it is more fundamental than that. I mean, that is a political solution at the surface, okay, which you could have if we all agreed on something. But there is incremental stuff. There are some Republicans now working bipartisanly with some Democrats on another. There's a big article in the New York Times today about a half dozen important issues that there is some bipartisan movement on. They might be able to get where there's common interest in that. They might get that through. But on the bigger picture of this situation, there are enormous interests in this country that do not want the green revolution to take place. There's the fossil fuel industry. There's a host of other industries that have enormous vested interest in keeping things going backwards instead of forward. And so to fix the system requires changing the fuel it operates on, which is money. There's a famous California politician called Jess Under, he was the Speaker of the House here, and he said money is the mother's milk of politics. And in order to change it, you have to change how it's financed. And to change how it's financed, you have to gain control of it. And you have to overturn the Supreme Court decision, and this is a tall order, and it's going to take some doing to do that. I have some extreme ideas of how it could be. People have talked about how it could be done. For example, you could, if the Democrats gain control of both houses and the presidency, which is possible, and they will at some point. If you do that, you subdivide the District of Columbia into 155 states, which you have the right to do, and put a congressman and senators for all of them, and then you have those states call for a constitutional convention, and you amend the American Constitution to permit regulation of funds and campaigns, to rewrite the Second Amendment, to do a whole bunch of things that would make us, we out here in California, we have 2 senators with 40 million people, and Wyoming has 2 with 500,000 people. So their vote counts 79 times as much as ours. And the whole electoral system, it was all something that was done in this corrupt decision that was made with the Virginia planters in the 1787 convention, where they came in, they said, we want slaves to be people, we want to have it affect the suffrage, and they got that through. And the little states loved it because they were going to originally, under Madison's plan, they were going to get proportional voting in the Senate. And now these planters wanting to keep slaves, Delaware, the little states said, well, how about it, in Connecticut, how about if we all have equal, suffrage in the Senate? Are they dumb enough to do that? Well, they did. And so now we have this distorted system that's grown 250 years out of whack. And, we have to go fix that whole thing to bring us back to eliminate gerrymandering and to eliminate ways people keep people from voting, to turn the presidency into a national referendum vote, and to make the representation in Congress congruent with population, which is what a democracy is, and get rid of this ridiculous electoral college thing and anachronism. And if you do all those fundamental things, you could turn America back into some powerhouse that would be enormously different than it is now. We reached our peak in the 60s, and when there was bipartisan support and control, people worked together. And we could get back to that. Our growth then was 7-8% a year throughout that whole period. And there was a lot of bipartisan stuff, and the Congress worked bipartisanly. And, Lyndon Johnson would call in the Senate Majority Leader, Everett Dirksen, and the two of them would sit and have a drink somewhere, and they would work things out. That's all gone now. And what we have is this horribly dysfunctional, but it's going to take very fundamental stuff to fix it. And we're not really talking about that yet. I think we will at some point soon, but what we see now is this horror of this horrid dysfunctional stuff growing in power every day and becoming more toxic and awful in every way. I mean, look at the COVID discussions that start out. Now the right is saying that COVID is imaginary, that the vaccines don't work, and we should be jailing, Fauci and things like that. I mean, this is so irrational and anti-scientific and factually deranged that it's scary, and it's moving that way across the board. I have visions of how we could fix it, but they depend on a lot of big changes in how we conduct elections, and that's going to require Democrats winning.
Well, I think
optimistic.
I think that we're actually doing a very similar thing with different information, because what you're doing by talking about everything that you're outlining here, Robert, in great detail, is educating people. A lot of people don't know the things that you're saying. I don't know some of the things that you're saying. And that's exactly what I'm trying. So you're talking about abuse of power at a very high level, at a very manipulative level, that's really could cause the demise of our country. And I'm talking about exactly the same thing from a psychological point of view. When abuse dynamics mushroom out of control, they do things like what you're talking about, like Past Citizens United, and have dark money influencing politics and elections. These are all the dynamics that abusers use to keep control. They malign the truth tellers is one of the things that happens in an abusive family. And that's what's happening in our country, that anyone who stands up and calls truth is maligned, is slaughtered in the press, is, barred from entering certain places to be witness to what's going on. So what I'm doing with my book is trying to educate people from a psychological point of view of the same dynamics that you're pointing out on a practical level. This is how it plays out. This is what happens when abuse runs rampant in our country. And so, I think we're very much in alignment. And I just want to highlight that I think educating people is one of the most important things. And that's why people who want to stand up for the things that you're saying and the things that I'm saying and the things that you're saying, Bo, we just have to keep doing it. And there's many, many, many of us. There's thousands and millions of people. We're just part of a great ocean of a tide that's rising, that really does want to expose the truth, that really does want to inform the average person on the street of what's actually happening to them.
Well, I agree with all you said, except that I see the tide going the other way to some extent. And the problem with educating people is that, as I point out in the memo I sent you, I see this worldview of the U.S. is controlled by this enormous collection of economic interest who have congruency of needs in certain ways, and they're going to block anything. And they have created their own network and their own media ecosystem. And that media ecosystem is enormously effective. And it's Fox and Newsmax and the whole series of social media. And it is creating this sewage pipe that goes down the throats of most common American citizens. And it is indoctrinating them with a whole series of horrors. And it is a hermetically sealed environment in which you go out we see people in websites, see people go out and talk to people on the street. I mean, they have no idea what's going on in the United States. And they turn on Fox News. There's studies that show people who watch it no less than people who don't watch any television. They are not only they know nothing. And there was a recent study actually that went out and asked people questions about civics and history and science, and determined that Americans know less today, all of them, than they've ever known. We are more ignorant today on fundamental things, not political things, but I mean things about science and history and civics, less know than ever before. And what these groups are doing is they create this thing, and I don't know how to penetrate it. I mean, people watch that every day, they hear that every day, and I just gave you some examples about how they're lying about fundamentally lying about everything. And how do you get those people? You know, I mean, they went out and they asked, you know, on CNN, went out in the street and talked to Trump voters, and they said, you know, what about this indictment? Every one of them went on and on about the two-tier system and how Biden got away with it. And they try to explain to him, no, he doesn't say that. It says something else. They've never read the indictment, and they have no idea what's going on, but they believe it, and they're being egged on every we have to figure out a way to penetrate that. And at last, I must confess, I don't have a ready answer for how to do that, you know, and how to get people to change their media habits. I make a point of listening to all of them, you know, to Newsmax and Fox and all of them. And I read the Wall Street Journal, and I read the conservatives, and I try to get this balance. And what are they thinking? Why are they thinking that? And you know, but I'm sadly I'm pretty alone in that. You know, most people have their media source, and that's what they believe. And that's, Lois, the problem as I see it is that we're talking to each other about educating people. You know, when you sit down with a Trump person, you know, you're up against a solid wall of, you know, no, that's not the way it is. Just like with people that live in Ukraine, we call the Russian family members and say, you're invading Ukraine. And they would say, no, they're Nazis there, and it's a rescue mission, and we're helping. It's a special military operation. And they had no idea. And you know, they couldn't penetrate that, and they still can't to this day. And so that, I think, is the central problem as I see it.
Bo?
I just absorbing. I think Robert's got his thumb on what's going on, you know, in the system. You have your thumb on the reasons for that and how mental health is affecting and shaping that. I'm trying to dig into a little bit of the history to find out how we got here, you know, because if you don't know where you're from, it's hard to know where you're going. And that's another reason why I thought, you know, perhaps looking through some historical events to see how they might have dealt with things could help us. But I'm kind of getting the feeling that maybe that doesn't necessarily apply. This is too modern, and this is too much of a unique situation historically. But then at the same time, Phyllis, you know, you're relating everything that's going on to very fundamental things. And so I think the big question for me, and Robert hasn't really answered it because he said he hasn't been able to penetrate how to do it. But how do we penetrate the system that we're currently living in to actually access reform? I mean, it's one thing for people to talk about it like you and I, but there's very little power in our hands other than sharing word of mouth and ideas and socializing these things amongst our friends and family. And, you know, that's a long road to recovery. Can we afford to wait that long? You know, what are the practical ways that we can borrow from maybe other nations or, you know, other cultures that would help us in our own? Is there any? And if there's not, then truly, what do we do?
Well, I see that where we came from is that, you know, by the 1880s and the Gilded Age, you had these individual industries like the railroad industry that found that they could give money to politicians, and they had tons of money. And it was enormously successful in getting them what they wanted and overriding the common citizens. And they were able to get up tariff arrangements and stuff that benefited big businesses at the expense of everybody else, even though it was much more populous. But the money, and then advertising was paid for by that. But as television came on the scene and the media, the cost of campaigns exponentially went up. And so the influence of money exponentially went up along with that. And if you can raise millions of dollars, you know, I was just in this incredible experience. I'm one of the top lobbyists for the California Civil Rights Alliance. You know, we spearhead about 650 green organizations, and I'm sitting there face to face with politicians in Sacramento, trying to convince them not to kill solar power because it's so successful. We're the most successful state by far. 2 million houses have rooftop solar because of you guys. Wonderful thing you did. But the utilities funded by fossil fuels are trying to kill it, and they are killing it. And I'm saying, how can you let this happen? And the seasoned lobbyists over, they put their arm around me, take me out, and say, Robert, you don't understand. They have millions of dollars, to go into the whorehouse here, and you don't have any. You have votes, but until you leverage that and say, we're going to defeat you unless you and mean it and show it, you get nothing. And so that's what's running the country is money. And the interests we were talking about, who will control, they have a whole lot more money than everybody else. I mean, they have all the money basically, and they're given that money through the Fox News ecosystem to get the legislation they want to avoid, and they give to both parties in many cases, and they are getting these enormous stuff for the extreme wealthy. And it's getting worse. But in 1950, San Francisco was the most egalitarian city in North America. The bottom 20% made only about, well, the top 20% made about 380% more than the bottom 20%. And then today the average CEO makes 400 times what the average worker makes. So in the course of last 80 years or so, San Francisco's gone from the most egalitarian city in North America to the least egalitarian city in North America, with this enormously wealthy fringe at the top, sucking up all this money, and they're just rolling in money, and they're using it to perpetrate this system, which makes them the money. And what is our leverage in that? I mean, theoretically, if we could get all the votes, we could, and so at some point the opportunity will happen. And a lot of people understand this. That's why we won what we've won, is that, there are a lot of Americans, probably the majority, who believe what we're talking about. 50% of all the Americans are in 8 states. And around the wealthy, educated parts of America, they're all on board with this. But it's the rest of the America, the poor, the rural areas, which are now Republican, who don't know this, and who don't know what they don't know. And so the battle is coming down between there's a huge reorganization going on, in which the Republican Party is becoming the party of poor people and poor working people, the ones who we're talking about, who are victimized by all this stuff. And the Democratic Party, which once was the workers' party, right? The Democratic Party is becoming the party of the elite and the wealthy and the educated and the big cities. And that's something dramatically different than it's ever been, since FDR put the coalition together. And Nixon changed it all when he passed the civil rights thing. He switched it, and because the Republicans were the liberals, and I tell people the story about these statues in Golden Gate Park to Republicans put there by San Francisco liberals. They said, what are these people doing here? I said, well, they were the liberals then, and so it switches around, things change, and this is the really meaningful movement that's going on now, and we have to figure out a way to operate in this new environment, in which all the players are changing jerseys, and get on top of that, and it's not hopeless. I don't have a lot of ready hard solutions. I don't know that I'm going to get anywhere. I went to Sacramento and sat down with these guys and looked them in the face, and I said, I've always wanted to do this, ever since I saw Ghostbusters, with that famous scene where the Ghostbusters asked the mayor of New York, will you help us do this? And he says, no way I'm going to do that. And one of them, Dan Aykroyd, puts his arm on the mayor and leads him off and says, Mr. Mayor, if you do this, you will endear yourself to millions of registered voters. And he looks this 1,000-yard stare, and he flips around and he says, okay, what do we have to do? And so I tried that. I've wanted to do that all my life, when I got to do it with real, in a real life setting. And I don't know they're going to do anything. I mean, they're way, and I got high-fived by all my fellow, but it's going to take leverage. Leverage is and that's what the Speaker of the House in Sacramento told me to my face. He says, Robert, you got to have leverage. It's got to be votes or money. And he's right. And so we as Democrats, we want to save the world. We have to get votes and money to do that. and they got all the money. So, it's going to be votes, and that means, licking envelopes and making phone calls and doing all the stuff that we do. And, Miriam and I spend time, every election, sitting there, reaching out to voters in other states and everything and trying to get this in. And we've been slowly making progress. And we have an opportunity, I think, coming up here in this next election, where there's going to be a chaos on the other side and not chaos on our side. As long as our candidate doesn't have a stroke or something or some unexpected thing, but we may have an opportunity here for getting over the edge and getting that majority back. And if we do, there's things that can be done to fix this. Okay, there's things that can be done to fix this. And so that's what if we want to do something on the mega level like this, it's got to be something along those lines. So that's my thinking,
Phyllis, what do you think about this?
Yeah. Well, originally I had several original titles for my book, and one of them was The Terror of the Situation and Hope for Our World. And I think you're talking about the terror of the situation. And I think it is a really dramatically horrifying situation that the whole world is in, and we're a big part of it. So I don't have any argument with anything you're saying about how dire some of the challenges are and the threats are that we face. And I believe myself that we're hovering on the edge of our own extinction. I think that's unchecked. These dynamics will either destroy the climate of the earth, or lead to a third world war, or lead to a society that is so run by inhuman and inhumane governance that we will have lost our humanity, and probably eventually the climate as well. So I do think it is a dire situation. And because I, come from the background I come from, and I'm going to just talk about my own, I had abuse in my own childhood, and the beginning of my life was very dark. And I didn't think that I was ever going to make it out of it. I really didn't. I thought there was hope for other people, but I really didn't think that there was hope for me. If you had looked at me, I didn't look that way. I functioned. I got married. I had kids. I got up in the morning. I cooked. I cleaned my house. But my life was under a very painful shadow. And I really didn't think it was ever going to get better. But I read books. I read books about other people's stories of making it out of trauma and dark places and overcoming tremendous odds. And I was fortunate enough to have people that I could work with who could see something in me that was not the negative picture that I had of myself, and who in their own often imperfect ways helped guide me through that darkness to eventually be able to find a reconnection to myself and some really significant light on the other side that I never thought was possible. And so if I can do it, anybody can do it. And the two best things that helped me, or two of the best things that helped me, were being able to read books by other people and get information that was not available to me from my own psyche, and to have help from other people. And we can do this for our neighbors. We can do this for, whatever our sphere of influence. You might have a huge sphere of influence, Robert. You have a big sphere of influence, Bo, with your podcast and the work that you do. We don't know who we can touch that might have an even bigger sphere of influence that can impact people in ways that we wouldn't know. I had a teacher in high school in an English class who thought I was a fabulous writer. You know what? That really changed something in my life. Just her belief in me. And I'm sure she's probably gone now, but she probably had no idea of the impact she had on my life. So I hold those two things together: the terror of the situation and hope for our world. And that's why I think we're doing what we're doing. And And I think the precipitous place we stand on, that we all stand on, is that the terror of the situation and the hope for our world are just like this, and we could tip so far that we won't be able to come back, but we don't have to, and that's my hope. That's the purpose of my work, that we don't have to. If we're informed, if we can influence other people, it might not happen in my lifetime. It might not happen. But while I'm here, I'm going to try, the best that I can.
We
Well,
talked to,
go ahead, Ben.
so we talked about the human spirit, and, that's probably, in my opinion, our saving grace. The human spirit has some qualities to it. Adaptability is one of them. Hope and optimism. Growth through adversity, that's a huge one. We can see that over and over throughout history. Connection and empathy, that's the one thing that I think globally will bring us all together, is that we all have that empathetic human nature to us.
Right.
And the other thing I think too is, if we can bring a purpose and a meaning that would somehow bring us together. I hate to say what I'm about to say, but we've been talking a lot about UFOs and the Pentagon release and stuff, and some top-notch whistleblower came out and said we have spaceships and alien bodies, and it's all true. If that does become true, that could be one of the things that potentially bring us together globally. It gives us a larger picture, which is something we need. And so whether that's all a hoax, which I don't think it is these days, but even if it is, we need something like that, something that will bring us together as a humanity. Can you think of anything other than, that far out ET stuff that can help us unite on a global level?
Well, I think that the thing that helps us unite on the state level and on a countrywide level is people who believe in America, people who believe in the ideals of America, as I do, people who are inspired by those ideals. Yeah, we had flaws and we had this and that, but underneath it all was this revolutionary idea, an inspiration to the whole world. The most influential event in the history of the world was the American Revolution and the Constitution that came out of it, and the values that were inspired and enshrined in the Constitution. And I believe in that. And I believe in America, and I believe in those ideals, and I believe in the American people. And, some people say, well, let's, if this happens, that happens, let's go to New Zealand. I ain't going anywhere. I'm staying here, and I'm fighting for my country. I'm fighting for my state, and I'll do what it takes. And I have a lot of friends helping me, and a lot of people in this country helping me. And I think that's our answer. And that's the only answer. And that if we stay here and we apply ourselves and we work with our fellow citizens and we make phone calls and lick envelopes and make contributions and organize and try to persuade our fellow citizens, that ultimately it has the chance of working. I agree with both of you that it might not, but it has the biggest and best chance of working. And we have to do that and try to make it work. And I think that we have this enormous cataclysmic opportunity in the next year and a half or so to make it work. And I'm going to be on the front lines, fighting away to make that work. And with any luck, we'll be back here in 18 months with some good news to talk about.
Phyllis?
Yes, we just have this, it's just this delicate balance of really speaking loudly about the cataclysmic, tide that we're rising on, and saying it's not too late. There is hope. And from my point of view, which I think is, the missing piece in a lot of conversations, from a mental health, psychological point of view, we know how to break the cycle of abuse. For many, many people, we know how to do it. We have to find the will to do it, and enough people who want to do it, and maybe enough threat to our potential existence that we're motivated to do it.
Give us the steps for breaking the cycle, just so that if they didn't catch our previous episodes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I had identified elements of repair in my book. It's one of the later chapters in the book that we use in the field of psychology and psychotherapy. And there are things that we all know. I'm not going to tell you anything you haven't heard, that you don't know, that you probably haven't tried to employ yourself. But the underlying principle of repair of our human relations, the goal is to reconnect. The goal is to find reconnection with each other, because when we reconnect, we don't want to do harm. That's just fundamental. But the steps of getting there, so there has to be some desire, even if it's not to reconnect to begin with. There has to be some desire to get out of the bad situation we're in and try something new. When couples come to therapy, they've tried what they know and it doesn't work. So the principles of repair that I have outlined are, number one is safety. And this was part of what the Truth and Reconciliation model exemplified, that it has to be safe to speak our truth. It has to be safe to speak our pain. It has to be safe to speak the things that we've done that we don't feel good about, that we need to take responsibility for. It has to be safe. That means non-judgment, non-violence, non-retaliation, that we're opening up this space of truth, of raw truth, vulnerable truth, scary truth sometimes, whether it's from our past or our present, because the goal is not to find out who's right and wrong, who's good and bad, but to heal, and to heal everyone. So these are some of the underlying tenets of the best psychotherapy. Okay. The next one is what I mentioned in that is the willingness to take responsibility for oneself. And that might be, it might be not as blame. Responsibility divorced from the whole world of shame and blame and punishment, but responsibility like, I did that. I said that. I, alienated you, or I spoke badly about you, or I did whatever I did. I hit you. And I'm sorry. I see, I'm willing to hear the impact on you. I'm willing, or if I was really truly the victim, I'm willing to tell you the depth of my pain and how that impacted my life and what I'm asking from you now that would help me heal. These all happen in a space of safety, non-judgment, non-violence, and non-shaming. And so, each one leads to the next. The next one is reparation. It might just be, I'm really sorry. And I want you to tell me everything you need to tell me, how angry you are at me, how hurt you were by me, what you would like me to do now. These are some of the examples. Or I might be the one to tell you. Okay, so reparation. And along with reparation is kind of rehabilitation. And I see that, as something that massively needs to move out into our social structure, that we're committed to rehabilitation of anyone who can be brought back to a functional, contributing, safe way of life, rather than just, locking people up for years and years and throwing the key away and blaming them and judging them. And the whole story about our justice system. Yeah. And then the next one is making agreements, having some kind of way to come back together. Even if I make an agreement, I don't totally like it, but I'm willing to do it for the sake of peace. Best option is, I have heard so deeply about your point of view, and I have felt so deeply listened to that I want to make agreements with you, and you want to make them with me. But short of that we make them for the sake of repair, that we make them for the sake of having a better relationship in the future. We make it for the sake of not having violence, whether it's emotional, verbal, or physical or sexual. And the last one is reconnection. And these are the elements of repair, that we actually reconnect. We feel each other. We have empathy for what we've gone through. Anybody that I've ever worked with that has really committed themselves to that deep listening process inevitably comes out of that process with more empathy for the other, and is receiving more empathy from the other person. And that's what heals us. That's what makes us happy. I say this over and over again in my book. What has hurt all of us are the injuries to love and belonging. And they're healed through rekindling love and belonging. And what is so sad and so confronting and so not talked about in our world is that love is not even used in the world of politics. We don't talk about that. And it's the best food for human beings. And it's ultimately what heals human beings. I've done lots of, processes with clients. I've done EMDR and inner child work and guided visualizations and psychodynamic work and some behavioral work. Lots and lots of processes, and they're all great. But you know what is at the heart of my therapy is I love people and I want them to get better. I'm rooting for them. I'm looking at them as their essence, not as the terrible things that happened to them or the terrible, beliefs they took on about themselves, or even the terrible things they've done. And that is psychological well-being. And I'm a stand for that. And I'll keep speaking about it. When I just want to say this one last thing. This sort of goes along with what I said before about my own history. As a psychotherapist, I was really comfortable with the one-on-one. I'm a one-on-one kind of person. I love deep conversation with my friends, with my family, with my husband, and with clients. I love that. I love going deep with people. I love that healing journey. I never imagined in a million years that I would want to have a public voice. It was not on my radar. And if you had told me that was where my life was going, I would have said, I'm not going there. And yet I couldn't not do that now with what I know and what I want to share. And we don't know who we can touch, who might have a way bigger voice than me.
Yeah, it's the ripples in the water. Robert, go ahead.
I think that what, hang on. I think that what Lois has just said, it was tender and touching and articulate and insightful and powerful. And I agree with all of it. And I think it's a wonderful vision to have. And from my political point of view, I think that once we have retaken the power in the system, and once we reformed it, which is, hopefully is a goal ahead. Once we've done that, then it's going to be time for truth and reconciliation, and it'll be fertile then, and people will be willing to listen then, and I hope that you, Phyllis, and others will come forward and play a role and lend your public voice to that dialogue, which can take place then. And heal the problems that we have. And I think that in order to be effective, we have to first win, the struggle, and we have to control, the organisms of government have to be under the people's control and the majority's control.
Well, I wouldn't argue with that. The only thing that I would just add is how are we going to get there? Unless more and more of us keep speaking up, speaking out, publishing our books, writing our articles, and, how are we going to get there? So I see this as one way to get to what you're talking about, one way. And there's, environmentalists working from another point of view, and scientists working from another point of view, and educators working from another point of view. We're part of something way bigger than any one of ourselves. But I think the powers that be now would like us to feel helpless, would like us to give up. And that's part of the abuse dynamic that we don't want to buy into.
I don't buy into it, and I don't feel helpless, and I agree with you that message can be empowering to people, and is one of the ways in which we can make progress and go forward And, I have my own voice and how I'm going to try to use that, to, along with those who agree with me, to take back power and use the political power process to heal, use it to reform, use it to make things better, to protect the environment, protect the weak, then we will need more than ever to hear the voices and listen to the voices and give power to the voices like yours. I hope that day is not that far away.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
And just to go back to our title, we're here listening to the cries for help and interpreting them back to anyone who can listen to us, like many people are doing, interpreting them back to some of the root causes that we could actually take the power back to address.
This has been Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany, exploring deep stories from real-life guests with real-life experiences, providing insight to our listeners with every story. Stay up to date on future podcasts by bookmarking Digital Voices with BoTiffany.podbean.com and follow Bo on social media by searching Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Have an idea for a future story? Send your idea to acrmadison@gmail.com. Until next time, grab life by the horns and keep inspiring others.